I've written part 1 as a natural, human-centered story in simple English, with a realistic emotional tone and strong audience retention. In the quiet center of a small town stood an old theater that most people passed without giving it much attention. The building had been there for decades. Its walls had seen celebrations, concerts, school plays, and memories that now lived only in faded photographs hanging in the hallway. During the day, the place was alive with voices, footsteps, music, and laughter. But once evening came and the last guests walked out, silence slowly filled every corner. Almost everyone in town knew the theater. Very few noticed the young woman who worked there. She arrived every morning before most people woke up. When the streets were still calm and the air still carried the cool feeling of dawn, she would unlock the side entrance and quietly step inside. She never made much noise. She moved through the building with the kind of calm that made people forget she was even there. She swept the floors. She wiped the dust from the old wooden seats. She cleaned fingerprints from glass doors. She arranged programs on tables. She checked every light. She folded forgotten jackets. She picked up empty bottles left behind after rehearsals. And somehow, by the time everyone else arrived, the theater always looked perfect. People appreciated her work, but not many truly knew her. Some greeted her with a quick smile. Some nodded politely. Some walked right past her without even looking. She never seemed bothered. She simply smiled, gave a quiet hello, and continued with her work. Nobody asked many questions, and she never offered many answers. That became normal. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And little by little, she became part of the theater itself. Always present, always dependable, always quiet. The theater manager trusted her more than anyone. If something needed fixing, she noticed it first. If a chair was broken, she had already moved it. If a light bulb stopped working, she had already reported it. If a performer forgot something, chances were she had already found it and placed it safely in the office. She noticed everything, but almost nobody noticed her. There was something different about her, though. Some people sensed it, not because of what she said, but because of the way she listened. Whenever musicians practiced on stage, she always slowed down just a little. While sweeping near the back rows, she would pause for half a second when someone played a beautiful melody. While carrying boxes across the hall, her steps somehow matched the rhythm of whatever song filled the room. Some people thought it was coincidence. Others never paid attention. But if someone watched carefully, they would see it. Music seemed to follow her. Or maybe she followed music. No one knew, and no one asked. At the far corner of the theater stood an old grand piano. It was beautiful once. Its black surface had lost some of its shine. Small scratches marked its sides. The keys had turned slightly yellow with age. The golden letters above the keys were faded enough that most people couldn't even read the brand anymore. But even old, it carried something special. It had history. People said famous musicians had once played it. Some said a traveling performer from another country had performed on it nearly 40 years ago. Some said the piano had been saved from a fire. Others said it had once belonged to someone important. No one really knew what stories were true, but everyone agreed on one thing. The piano still sounded beautiful. Professional performers used it during concerts. Students practiced on it during lessons. Guests admired it. And after every performance, when everyone went home, it sat alone, waiting. One evening, after a long day filled with rehearsals for the town's upcoming music festival, the theater finally became quiet. The last performer packed up. The last teacher turned off the stage lights. The last conversation faded into the night. The front doors locked. Silence returned. The only sound left was the soft hum of old ceiling lights. She finished cleaning the main hall. She collected empty paper cups. She straightened the music stands. She checked every row. Then she looked toward the stage. And for a few seconds, she simply stood there. The grand piano sat in the center under a single dim light. Waiting. She looked toward the doors. Empty. Toward the balcony. Empty. Toward the backstage curtains. Still. No one. Slowly, she climbed the stage steps. Her footsteps were so light they barely made a sound. She walked toward the piano like someone returning to a place they knew by heart. When she reached it, she didn't sit right away. Instead, she gently ran her fingers across the edge of the instrument, almost like greeting an old friend. Her eyes softened. A small smile appeared. Then she sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Her breathing slowed. The empty hall waited. And then, one finger touched a single key. A soft note floated into the room. Clear, warm, gentle. It echoed through the empty seats like a secret. Then another note. And another. Soon both hands moved across the keys with quiet confidence. The melody wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to impress. It wasn't fast. It wasn't complicated. It was simple, honest, beautiful. The kind of music that made a person stop thinking. The kind of music that made memories appear without warning. The sound filled every corner of the old theater. Up the walls, across the balcony, behind the curtains, into the empty seats, and somehow, into places even silence couldn't reach. She closed her eyes as she played. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved naturally, as if they had been waiting all day for this moment. There was no audience, no applause, no cameras, no spotlight, just her, and the piano. And somewhere in that quiet night, a man walking down the hallway suddenly stopped. He had returned to the theater to collect a folder he had forgotten in his office. He had almost reached the door when he heard the music. At first, he thought someone had left a recording playing. But then he listened more carefully. No recording sounded like that. This was real. Alive. Human. He stood completely still. The music pulled him closer without him even realizing it. Step by step, he followed the sound. Down the hallway, past the office, through the backstage corridor, until he reached the small crack in the stage door. He looked through, and what he saw made him freeze. Under a single soft light, the quiet young woman everyone thought of as just another worker was sitting at the old piano, playing like she had spent her entire life speaking through music. His hand remained on the door handle, but he didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, listening. And for the first time since he had taken over the theater, he realized that the greatest talent in the building had been there all along. The man stood in complete silence near the stage door, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever magic was filling the theater. He had come back for something simple, a forgotten folder, a few papers, a quick stop before heading home. But now none of that mattered. His hand remained on the door handle while the music continued flowing through the empty hall. Every note felt alive. It was soft, but it carried something powerful. It was the kind of music that didn't ask for attention. It simply reached people before they even realized they were listening. He had spent most of his life around music. He had worked in concert halls. He had watched trained performers. He had organized festivals. He had listened to musicians who spent years studying under famous teachers. And yet, there was something in this performance that felt different. Something honest. Something impossible to teach. He stayed there until the final note slowly faded into silence. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Even the air in the room felt still. The young woman kept her hands resting gently on the keys. Her eyes remained closed as if she wasn't ready to return to the world outside the music. Then she opened them. She took a slow breath. And that was the moment she noticed him. Her body froze. Her fingers pulled away from the piano as if she had touched something forbidden. For a second, neither of them said a word. Then she quickly stood up. "I'm sorry." Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. "I thought everyone had gone home." The man slowly stepped into the room. His face showed no anger, no surprise, only quiet admiration. "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. She looked down at the floor. Most people would have smiled after hearing that, but not her. Instead, she looked nervous, almost frightened. She folded her hands in front of her and avoided eye contact. "I shouldn't have touched it without permission," she said. He walked closer to the stage but kept his voice calm. How long have you been playing? She hesitated. A little. He smiled slightly. A little. She didn't answer. The silence between them said more than words ever could. He looked at the piano, then back at her. I've heard professionals play on that instrument, he said. She looked even more uncomfortable. Please. She shook her head. Don't say things like that. Why not? Because it isn't true. He studied her face for a moment. It wasn't false modesty. It wasn't someone fishing for praise. She truly didn't believe what she had just done was anything special. And somehow that made it even more remarkable. He leaned against one of the front seats and crossed his arms. Sit. She blinked. What? Sit at the piano. Her eyes widened. No. He smiled. That wasn't a request. She looked around the empty hall like she was searching for an escape. There's no reason. There's every reason. She stayed silent. After a long moment, she slowly sat back down. Her hands rested in her lap, not on the keys. He sat in the front row. For the first time, she wasn't alone with the piano. For the first time, someone was truly listening. Play anything, he said. She swallowed nervously. Her fingers trembled slightly as they moved toward the keys. The first note came softly, then another, and another. Within seconds, the nervousness disappeared. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed, and the music returned. But this time he watched more carefully. Not just the notes. Her hands, her posture, her timing, her control. The way her fingers moved without hesitation. The way she shaped every sound. The way emotion seemed to live inside every note. This wasn't someone who played as a hobby. This wasn't hidden talent discovered by accident. This was years. Years of practice. Years of discipline. Years of love. When she finished, he remained seated for several seconds. Then he stood and asked the question that changed everything. Who taught you? Her fingers slowly left the keys. She stared at them for a moment before answering. My father. The words came quietly, almost carefully. The man waited. She rarely talked about herself. Everyone at the theater knew that. She came. She worked. She smiled. She left. That was all. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was because someone had finally noticed. Maybe it was because the music had opened a door she usually kept locked. Or maybe she was simply tired of carrying the story alone. She looked at the empty seats before speaking again. He repaired pianos. Her voice stayed soft. In small towns, old schools, churches, anywhere people needed help. The man listened carefully. When I was little, he took me everywhere. A small smile appeared. I used to sit beside him while he worked. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes he'd fix broken keys, tune strings, replace pedals. She paused. And while he worked, her fingers touched the piano again. He taught me. The man stayed silent. She wasn't finished. We never had much. She smiled sadly. Actually, she looked toward the ceiling. We had almost nothing. The words carried no bitterness, only truth. But music. She touched a key. We always had music. A single soft note filled the hall. My father believed that if you could play with honesty, another note, people would hear your heart before they heard your mistakes. The man felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just telling a story. She was remembering someone she still carried every day. What happened? He asked quietly. Her fingers stopped moving. The smile faded. And for the first time that night, her eyes looked heavy. Life happened. Simple words. Heavy meaning. She stood from the piano and walked slowly toward the edge of the stage. The man didn't interrupt. She looked out at the empty hall. When I was 16, she paused. My father got sick. Silence. The repairs stopped. She folded her arms tightly. The lessons stopped. Another pause. And eventually, her voice became quieter. Everything stopped. The man lowered his eyes. He understood. No details were needed. Some pain didn't need long explanations. She took a slow breath. My mother needed help. She turned back toward him. My younger brother needed school. She smiled softly. And dreams. She shrugged. Dreams can wait. The man said nothing, because he knew that sentence. He had heard it from talented people his entire life. People who put family first. People who chose responsibility over passion. People who quietly disappeared before anyone noticed what they could have become. She looked around the theater. This job came when we needed it. She smiled. Steady work. She touched one of the old seats. Kind people. She looked toward the piano. And after everyone leaves, a small light returned to her eyes. I still get this. The man took a deep breath. Everything suddenly made sense. The quietness, the humility, the hidden talent, the late nights, the soft footsteps, the way she always paused during rehearsals. She hadn't left music behind. She had simply learned to love it in silence. And somehow, that silence had made her stronger. The man looked at her carefully, then asked one final question. One day, he spoke slowly. If the chance ever came, he stepped closer. Would you play in front of people? She looked at him, then looked at the empty seats, row after row, hundreds of chairs, hundreds of eyes she imagined staring back. Her face tightened, her breathing changed, and after a long silence, she whispered only two words. I can't. But deep inside, for the first time in years, she wasn't completely sure that was true. After that night, something inside the theater quietly changed. Nothing looked different from the outside. The lights still turned on every morning. The chairs were still lined up in perfect rows. The floors still shined. The posters for the upcoming music festival still covered the front windows. People still walked in carrying instruments, sheet music, coffee cups, and busy schedules. And the quiet young woman still arrived before sunrise, unlocked the side door, and began her work like she always had. To everyone else, everything looked exactly the same. But to the theater manager, nothing was the same anymore. Now every time he saw her carrying boxes across the hallway, he didn't just see a worker. He saw a musician. Every time she swept near the stage while others rehearsed, he noticed how her steps matched the rhythm. Every time a pianist made a mistake during practice, he caught her smiling softly, almost as if she already knew how the piece was supposed to sound. And every night, long after everyone had gone home, he listened, sometimes from backstage, sometimes from the balcony, sometimes from the hallway outside the main doors. He never interrupted. He never announced himself. He simply listened. And every single night, she amazed him even more. Some nights she played gentle melodies that felt like old memories. Some nights she played bright pieces full of energy and life. Some nights she played slow, emotional music that made the empty hall feel almost alive. And sometimes, she played songs he had never heard before. Songs that sounded too personal to belong to anyone else. Songs that felt like chapters of a life she had never spoken about. The more he listened, the more one thought kept returning to him. This talent cannot stay hidden forever. But he also knew pushing too hard would only make her step further back. She wasn't someone chasing applause. She wasn't waiting to be discovered. If anything, she seemed happiest when nobody was watching. So he waited. And while he waited, the biggest event of the year grew closer. The town's annual music festival. For weeks, the theater became busier than ever. Musicians came from nearby cities. Students signed up for workshops. Teachers prepared performances. Tickets sold faster than expected. The streets outside filled with banners and posters. Coffee shops played classical music. Local newspapers talked about the event. Everyone in town seemed excited. And at the center of it all, the theater. Every room was full. The practice halls, the backstage dressing rooms, the offices, the storage rooms. Even the hallways were crowded with people carrying instruments and rushing from one rehearsal to another. The quiet young woman moved through all of it like she always did. Calm, focused, invisible. She carried chairs, moved music stands, delivered water bottles, fixed loose curtains, found missing sheet music. and somehow managed to help everyone without drawing attention to herself. Some performers thanked her. Some barely noticed. She didn't seem to care. But the manager watched carefully, and he noticed something else. Whenever the guest pianist rehearsed on the grand piano, she always paused. Not for long. Only a second. Sometimes two. Just enough to listen. Then she would quietly continue her work. The guest pianist was well known. People had traveled from other towns just to hear him perform. His name was printed on every poster. His picture hung in the lobby. The final concert of the festival was built around his performance. The entire town was waiting for that night. And he was good. Very good. Confident. Precise. Experienced. Every rehearsal sounded polished. Every movement looked professional. Everything seemed perfect. Until 3 days before the concert. That morning started like any other. The theater opened early. Musicians arrived. Coffee cups appeared. Voices filled the hall. And then, something felt wrong. The manager noticed it first. The guest pianist hadn't arrived. That wasn't normal. He was always early. Always prepared. Always the first person on stage. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. Finally, the manager's phone rang. He answered. And within seconds, his face changed. The room around him suddenly felt smaller. The call lasted less than a minute. But when it ended, everything had changed. The guest pianist had injured his hand. A serious strain during a private practice session. Doctor's orders. No performance. No rehearsals. No concert. At least not for him. The manager stood silently for several seconds. Then the questions began. What happened? Is he okay? Can he still play? What about the concert? What do we tell people? Within minutes, the news spread through the building. Voices grew louder. Schedules changed. Phone calls started. Organizers rushed through hallways. Teachers whispered. Performers looked worried. And for the first time in weeks, the theater felt uncertain. The manager gathered the organizing team in his office. Papers covered the desk. Phones rang nonstop. Suggestions came from every direction. Find someone from the city. Call the conservatory. Maybe postpone. Maybe cancel. Maybe replace the solo piece. Maybe refund the tickets. Everyone talked. Everyone had ideas. But nothing felt right. Finding a pianist of that level in 3 days? Almost impossible. And even if they found someone, would they know the program? Would they connect with the audience? Would people still come? The manager listened quietly. But deep down, his mind kept returning to one person. The quiet young woman. He tried to ignore the thought. At first, it sounded impossible. Ridiculous, even. How could he replace a famous concert pianist? With someone nobody in town even knew could play? How would people react? How would sponsors react? How would the audience react? How would she react? Still, the thought refused to leave. That evening, while the building slowly emptied, he walked through the hallway in silence. Past rehearsal rooms. Past empty classrooms. Past posters and stage props. Until he reached the main hall. She was there. Alone. Wiping fingerprints off the front row seats. Just another normal evening. At least on the surface. He stood there for a moment. Watching. Trying to find the right words. She noticed him and smiled politely. Long day. He gave a small laugh. You could say that. She looked at him carefully. Something in his face told her this wasn't casual conversation. She placed the cloth on one of the chairs. What happened? He took a deep breath. Then slowly walked closer. The pianist won't be performing. Her expression changed. What? He injured his hand. She looked toward the stage. Toward the grand piano. Then back at him. That's terrible. He nodded. It is. Silence filled the hall. Then she quietly said, You'll find someone. He looked directly at her. That's what I'm hoping. She smiled softly. You always do. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he finally said the words he had been carrying all day. What if? He paused. What if I already found someone? She looked confused. Who? He held her gaze, and for the first time, she understood exactly where this conversation was going. Her smile disappeared. The cloth slipped from her hand and fell quietly onto the floor. And before he could say another word, she took one slow step back. She took one slow step back. Then another. Her eyes stayed locked on his face, almost as if she was waiting for him to laugh and admit it was some kind of joke. But he didn't. He simply stood there, calm and serious. The silence between them suddenly felt heavier than the piano sitting on the stage. Finally, she shook her head. No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Almost like she had been preparing to say it long before he even asked. The manager didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once. Okay. That caught her off guard. She blinked. Okay. He smiled slightly. I said okay. She looked confused. For a moment, she didn't know what to do with that. She had expected pressure, questions, persuasion, maybe even disappointment. But instead, he just stood there calmly, as if he had all the time in the world. She bent down, picked up the cloth she had dropped, and turned away from him. I'm not the person you need. Her voice was quiet again, controlled, safe. She started wiping the armrest of a chair that was already perfectly clean. The manager walked slowly toward the front row and sat down. He didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he asked softly, Why? She kept wiping. Because I'm not a performer. He looked at the empty stage. Maybe not. She stopped for half a second. Then continued. I'm not trained. He smiled. I've heard trained. She looked down. Still wiping. Still avoiding eye contact. I haven't played in front of people. That can change. She shook her head. No. Her answer came stronger this time. Almost sharp. And for the first time since he had known her, he saw fear. Not nervousness. Not shyness. Fear. Real fear. She placed the cloth on the seat and folded her arms. You don't understand. The manager leaned forward slightly. Then help me understand. She stayed silent. Her breathing had changed. Slower. Heavier. She looked toward the piano. Then toward the empty rows. Then back at him. Finally, she spoke. You hear me play when nobody's here? He nodded. Yes. She swallowed. That's not the same. He stayed quiet. She looked away again. When nobody's watching. Her voice softened. There's no chance to disappoint anyone. The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Painfully real. The manager didn't interrupt. He knew better now. She wasn't refusing because she lacked talent. She was refusing because somewhere in her past, something had convinced her that being seen was dangerous. She slowly walked toward the stage steps and sat down. Not on stage. Not in the audience. Right in between. Like someone who never fully belonged in either place. The manager stayed seated in the front row. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Then she looked down at her hands. When I was younger, her voice was softer now. My father used to say I played like music was part of my breathing. The manager listened carefully. She smiled faintly. He'd make me practice before sunrise. She looked at her fingers. In winter, she laughed quietly. My hands would be freezing. The manager smiled. She continued. He'd say. She paused. Then quietly repeated the words. If your hands are cold, play until your heart warms them. The manager felt a small smile appear. It sounded exactly like something a teacher who loved music would say. But her smile didn't last. It slowly faded. Her eyes became distant. I believed him. She looked toward the stage. I believed I'd spend my whole life playing. Silence. Then she took a slow breath. But life had other plans. The manager didn't move. He let her speak at her own pace. She folded her hands tightly. After he got sick, her voice became quieter. Everything changed. She looked down. We sold almost everything. She smiled sadly. The extra furniture. A pause. The old car. Another pause. Even some of his tools. Her fingers tightened. But the piano. She looked toward the grand piano on stage. That stayed. The manager stayed silent. He couldn't play anymore. She swallowed. But every evening, her voice softened. He'd sit beside me. She smiled faintly. And listen. The manager could almost picture it. A small room. An old piano. A father listening. A daughter playing. She took another breath. One night. She paused longer this time. Some people came. The manager waited. They heard me practicing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. One of them worked at a music school. The manager leaned slightly forward. She nodded. They offered me a scholarship. For the first time, he understood. He didn't say anything. He just listened. She gave a quiet laugh. I thought my life had started. Her smile disappeared. But that same week, her voice cracked slightly. My father got worse. Silence. I had to choose. She didn't need to explain more. He understood. Family. Responsibility. Reality. Dreams waiting in the background. She looked at him. I stayed. The manager nodded slowly. Of course you did. She smiled faintly. Everyone said I was strong. Her eyes looked tired. But honestly, she shook her head. I was scared. The manager stayed quiet. Scared of losing him. A pause. Scared of leaving. Another pause. And after he was gone, her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Scared of finding out I wasn't good enough. The words hit harder than anything she had said before. Because now, the truth was clear. She wasn't afraid of performing. She was afraid of proving to herself that the dream she had protected all these years was never real. The manager slowly stood, then walked toward the stage. He stopped a few feet away from her. You know what I think? She looked up. He smiled. I think you've been protecting your talent so long. He looked toward the piano. That you forgot talent doesn't stay alive by hiding. She stared at him. He continued. You're not scared of the audience. He looked directly into her eyes. You're scared they'll confirm what fear has been whispering for years. Her breathing stopped for a second. Because he was right. And she knew it. She looked away. Tears didn't fall. But her eyes glistened under the theater lights. The manager looked toward the empty rows. You know what I see? She stayed silent. He smiled. I see hundreds of empty seats. He turned back toward her. Not judges. He pointed toward the piano. Not critics. Then he placed his hand over his chest. Just people. She stared at him. People. Such a simple word. Yet somehow, changed something. He took one step back. I'm not asking for your answer tonight. She blinked. I'm not. He shook his head. No. He smiled. I'm giving you 24 hours. She looked surprised. Why? He laughed softly. Because if I leave you longer than that. He pointed at her with a playful smile. You'll think of 50 reasons to say no. For the first time that evening, she laughed. A real laugh. Small. Unexpected. Human. And for one brief moment, the fear disappeared. The manager started walking toward the exit. Then stopped near the door. Without turning around, he said one final thing. If your father could sit in the front row one more time. His voice softened. Would he want to see you cleaning the stage? A pause. Or standing on it? Then he walked out. The theater became silent again. She sat there alone. Between the stage and the audience. Between the life she had chosen and the life she had left behind. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the question. She was afraid of the answer. That night, after the manager walked out of the theater, she didn't move for a long time. The building was silent. The lights above the stage gave off a soft golden glow, just bright enough to light the empty seats stretching row after row in front of her. She sat on the edge of the stage exactly where he had left her. Not on the piano bench. Not in the audience. Still somewhere in between. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Her eyes stayed fixed on the grand piano. She could still hear his words. If your father could sit in the front row one more time, would he want to see you cleaning the stage, or standing on it? She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, she let herself remember everything. Not just the easy memories, not just the warm ones, all of them, the cold mornings, the long practice sessions, the old piano with chipped wood, her father tuning strings while humming quietly, the smell of coffee in their tiny kitchen, his rough hands guiding her fingers, his voice counting rhythm, his laughter when she made mistakes, and the way he always looked at her, as if he already knew who she could become. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Then she stood, slowly, quietly, and walked toward the piano. She sat down, placed both hands on the keys, and began to play. But tonight felt different. This wasn't practice. This wasn't escape. This wasn't hiding. This felt like a conversation. A conversation with someone no longer there, but somehow still listening. The notes started softly, gentle, careful, almost uncertain. But little by little, the music grew stronger, warmer, more alive. And as the melody filled the empty theater, something inside her began to change. Fear was still there. Doubt was still there. But now, something else was growing louder. Something stronger. Something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She played until her hands felt tired. Then she sat in silence, her breathing slow, her heart racing, and for the first time, she whispered the words out loud. I want to do it. No one heard her. No one needed to. By sunrise, her decision had already been made. The next morning, the theater manager arrived earlier than usual. He barely slept. His desk was covered in schedules, ticket reports, backup plans, phone numbers, and unfinished cups of coffee. He was already preparing himself for another day of difficult decisions. Maybe cancel the solo performance. Maybe shorten the concert. Maybe find a local teacher willing to step in. Maybe. A knock came at his office door. He looked up and froze. She stood there, quiet as always, hands folded, calm, but different. Something in her eyes had changed. He slowly stood up. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then she said 3 words. I'll do it. The manager blinked. For a second, he wasn't sure he heard correctly. Then a smile slowly spread across his face. A real smile. The kind that comes when hope wins. You're serious? She nodded once. Yes. He laughed softly and shook his head. I knew it. She raised an eyebrow. No, you didn't. He smiled. No. He admitted. I just hoped. For the first time, she smiled back. But the smile didn't last long. Reality quickly returned. Her expression became serious. There's one problem. He crossed his arms. Only one. She took a breath. I haven't performed in front of people. He nodded. I know. She looked toward the hallway. I've never performed in front of anyone. He paused, then smiled. Well. He picked up his notebook. There's a first time for everything. And just like that, the next 48 hours became unlike anything either of them had imagined. The theater became a world of secrets. During the day, everything looked normal. Musicians rehearsed. Students attended workshops. Visitors toured the building. Staff prepared programs. Nobody suspected anything. The posters still showed the famous pianist. The official announcement hadn't been made yet. Only a few people knew the truth. And even fewer knew who the replacement would be. But once the theater doors closed each evening, everything changed. The main hall became hers. The stage, the lights, the piano, the silence, and the manager. Night after night they worked. Not just on music, on confidence. The manager sat in different rows while she played. Front row, middle, balcony, back corner. Anywhere an audience might be. First, she struggled. Her hands trembled. She missed notes she normally played perfectly. Her breathing became uneven. Sometimes she stopped halfway through. Sometimes she stood up and walked away from the piano completely. I can't. She said it more than once. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes frustrated. Sometimes with tears in her eyes. And every time, the manager gave the same answer. Yes, you can. Not because he wanted to pressure her, but because he had heard the truth. And the truth was stronger than fear. On the second night, something changed. She stopped trying to play perfectly, and started playing honestly. The mistakes didn't disappear, but they stopped controlling her. Her breathing became steadier. Her hands became lighter. Her shoulders relaxed. And slowly, the music returned. By the final rehearsal, even the manager sat in silence. Not because he was judging, not because he was analyzing, but because he had forgotten he was listening to practice. It already sounded like a performance. The next morning, the official announcement was made. The guest pianist would not perform due to injury. A replacement would take the stage. No name, no explanation, just mystery. And instantly, the town started talking. Coffee shops buzzed with rumors. Social media filled with guesses. Music students made predictions. Teachers argued. Some were curious. Some were excited. Some were worried. Tickets, surprisingly, didn't get refunded. If anything, people became even more interested. Who could possibly replace someone that famous with only 2 days' notice? By evening, every seat was sold. Backstage, the theater felt alive. Musicians adjusted instruments. Staff checked lighting. Programs were stacked. Curtains moved. Whispers filled every hallway. And in a small dressing room near the stage, she sat alone, still, quiet. Her performance clothes felt unfamiliar, simple, elegant, nothing flashy. Her hands rested in her lap, and despite all the rehearsals, her heart felt like it might break through her chest. A soft knock came at the door. The manager stepped inside. He didn't speak right away. He simply handed her something, a folded piece of paper. She opened it. Inside, only one sentence, written by hand. If your hands are cold, play until your heart warms them. Her breathing stopped. Her fingers touched the words. And suddenly, she wasn't afraid anymore. She looked up. The manager smiled. 5 minutes. Then he quietly left. She sat there staring at the note, then folded it carefully, placed it close to her heart, and stood. Outside, the audience was already filling the hall. Hundreds of voices, hundreds of footsteps, hundreds of expectations, and not one of them knew that the person about to walk onto that stage was the same quiet woman who had been cleaning their seats for years. Backstage, everything suddenly felt louder. The footsteps, the voices, the movement of curtains, the soft sound of instruments being adjusted. Even the ticking clock on the dressing room wall seemed louder than normal. She stood alone for a moment, holding the small folded note close to her chest. Her fingers gently touched the paper one last time before she placed it carefully into her pocket. Then she closed her eyes. She took one deep breath, then another. Her heart was still racing, but something had changed. The fear was still there. She could feel it, but it no longer felt bigger than her. For years, fear had been the loudest voice in her life. Fear of failing, fear of being seen, fear of disappointing people, fear of discovering that the dream she had protected for so long was never real. But now, another voice had finally become louder. Her father's voice, warm, steady, certain. If your hands are cold, play until your heart warms them. A soft knock came at the dressing room door. Then the manager stepped inside. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply smiled. Then he held out his hand. Ready? She looked at him. For a moment, she wanted to say no. Her body still wanted to run, to hide, to return to the safe life she understood. The quiet mornings, the empty theater, the late-night practice sessions when nobody was watching. That life was familiar, safe, predictable, but safe had never made dreams come true. She looked at his hand. Then slowly, she took it, and together they walked toward the stage. The hallway felt longer than ever before. Every step seemed heavier. Each breath felt deeper. As they got closer, the sound of the audience became clearer. Hundreds of voices, laughter, whispers, programs turning, seats moving, people waiting, people wondering. people expecting something. Neither of them spoke. At the edge of the curtain, the manager stopped. He turned toward her. For a second, he simply looked at her. Not as an employee. Not as someone who worked behind the scenes. Not as the quiet woman everyone overlooked. But as an artist. As someone who had earned this moment long before anyone knew her name. He smiled. Then said quietly, "Don't play for them." She looked confused. He pointed gently toward her heart. "Play from there." Then he stepped back. And the stage assistant gave the signal. It was time. The curtains slowly opened. The lights grew brighter. And for one brief second, everything felt completely still. Then she stepped forward. The first sound she heard wasn't applause. It was silence. Hundreds of people. And not one of them made a sound. She could feel their eyes. Every single one. Watching. Trying to understand. Trying to figure out who she was. The whispers started almost immediately. Quiet. Confused. Curious. Who is she? Is this the replacement? I've never seen her before. Wasn't she working here? I think she cleans the theater. The words floated through the front rows. She heard some of them. And for a split second, the old fear returned. Her hands felt cold. Her breathing tightened. Her feet almost stopped moving. But then, her fingers touched the folded note in her pocket. And everything changed. She walked to the center of the stage. Toward the grand piano. Toward the same instrument she had played alone for years. But tonight, nothing was hidden. Tonight, everything would be seen. She reached the bench. Paused. And looked out at the audience. Row after row. Face after face. Young students. Parents. Teachers. Musicians. Neighbors. People she had passed in hallways for years. People who smiled at her. People who barely noticed her. People who thought they knew exactly who she was. None of them knew. Not really. Not yet. She sat down. Placed both hands gently above the keys. And suddenly, the entire theater felt impossibly quiet. So quiet she could hear someone breathing in the front row. So quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then, she played. The first note was soft. So soft that some people leaned forward. The second note followed. Then the third. And within seconds, something incredible happened. The whispers stopped. The movement stopped. The curiosity stopped. Because suddenly, none of that mattered. Only the music did. Her hands moved across the keys with calm confidence. Not rushed. Not nervous. Not trying to impress. Simply honest. The melody began quietly. Like a memory. Like an old story being told by someone who had lived every word. The audience listened. Completely still. The students in the front row stopped taking notes. The teachers stopped whispering. Even the musicians backstage stood frozen behind the curtains. The manager watched from the wings. And slowly, he smiled. Because the woman who once said, "I can't," had disappeared. And in her place, stood exactly who she had always been. The music grew stronger, deeper, more powerful. The soft melody became something bigger. Something emotional. Something impossible to ignore. Some people smiled. Some closed their eyes. Some held their breath. And some, without even realizing it, began wiping tears from their faces. In the third row, an older man removed his glasses and quietly cleaned his eyes. A young girl sitting beside her mother stared at the stage without blinking. A music teacher slowly lowered the program in her hands. And in the balcony, someone whispered only one word. "Wow!" But even that felt too loud. Because the music had taken over everything. It wasn't perfect. A few notes weren't flawless. A few moments weren't textbook. But somehow, that made it even more powerful. Because it wasn't performance. It was truth. And truth doesn't need perfection. It only needs courage. She played like every late night. Every silent practice. Every memory. Every sacrifice. Every goodbye. Every fear. Every dream. Had found its way into her hands. And by the time she reached the final movement, the entire audience had forgotten they were watching a replacement. They weren't comparing. They weren't judging. They weren't wondering who she was anymore. Because now, they knew. The final notes came slowly, softly, beautifully, and then, one last chord. It echoed through the theater, across the walls, through the balcony, into every corner of the building. Then silence. Complete silence. She kept her hands on the keys, her breathing slow, her eyes closed, and for one brief second, nothing happened. No applause, no voices, no movement, and suddenly, old fear whispered, maybe they hated it. Maybe. Then it happened. One person stood, then another, then 5, then 20, then 50, and within seconds, the entire theater rose to its feet. The sound of applause exploded through the hall like thunder, louder than any note she had played. People cheered, people smiled, people cried, people clapped until their hands turned red, and she just sat there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to fully understand what was happening. The manager stepped onto the stage. He walked toward her slowly, and for the first time, she saw tears in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply nodded. And somehow, that said everything. She stood, slowly, and looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces. Hundreds of people standing. Hundreds of people cheering. For someone they had walked past for years without truly seeing. And in that moment, she looked toward the empty front row seat. The seat nobody had reserved. The seat nobody had touched. And for just a second, she smiled. Because deep in her heart, she knew. Her father had never missed the performance. Not really. And neither would anyone else who had been there that night. Because what began as a soft practice had become a piano performance no one could ever forget.